Hello, and thank you for tuning in to my presentation. My name is Cefalu. I'm a sophomore at Meredith College, and I'll be talking about my research on the relationships between personality, stress, and coping style in high school students. We're going to start off with a little introduction to my project, and then we're going to move into how I conducted my research, my results, and then lastly discuss these results in greater depth. Afshar et al. Conducted a 20-year longitudinal study with adults looking at personality type and coping. They used the Big Five personality inventory to group participants into openness, conscientiousness, extrovertedness, agreeableness, or neuroticism as personality types. Afshar et al. Found that neuroticism was the only personality type that did not have adaptive qualities and was associated with higher stress levels. In 2014, Roxas and Glenwick looked at perceived stress and coping style in 597 high schoolers. Two types of adaptive coping were used in the subscale of the coping scale for children and youth, which were problem solving and assistance seeking. There were also two types of maladaptive coping, which were cognitive and behavioral avoidance. Roxas and Glenwick found that the avoidant coping types had higher overall stress levels and that adaptive copers were able to lower stress over time. From this literature, I was able to develop some research questions that I wanted to look at in my population. First, how do stress levels in students with different personalities change over time? And second, do students who cope in different ways differ in their amounts of stress over time? My hypotheses were that task-oriented students would have lower mean stress levels than relationship-oriented students, and also that problem-focused copers would have lower mean stress scores than emotion-focused copers. My participants were 48 high-achieving high school students who were rising seniors attending the Governor's School East program in the Social Sciences Division. Governor's School East, or GSE, is a rigorous academic summer program hosted at Meredith College. The first scale that was used was the Personality Descriptor Profile, or the PDP, developed by Edwards and Reddy in 2006. This inventory groups participants into having either a task or relationship-oriented personality type. Relationship orientation includes characteristics such as attractiveness, risk-taking, outspoken, popular, and socially oriented. Task orientation includes goal-oriented, academically oriented, book smart, resourceful, and mature. The students were assigned task or relationship orientation based on their highest composite score. The next scale I used was the Brief Academic and Social Stress Scale developed by Pantilin and Woolard in 2013. Scores from items on the stress scale were averaged to give each student a stress score for each time point. The third and final scale that I used was the Brief Cope developed by Carver in 1997, derived from his full cope inventory. A factor analysis was used to group the cope's subscales into either problem or emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused copers use active coping, instrumental and emotional support, planning, and positive reframing. Emotion-focused copers use self-distraction, denial, humor, and behavioral disengagement. Here are some examples of items on the Brief Cope. I have labeled a few of the questions according to their subscale, just to give a general idea of how emotion versus problem-focused coping is determined. Data were collected at 4 time points, and there was about 2 weeks between each collection. The PDP was only administered at time 1 because, in theory, personality shouldn't change over time. It's also important to note that students went home for a week-long break after time 2, and the possible influences of this are discussed later on. A confirmatory factor analysis grouped the PDP into task and relationship orientation, and an exploratory factor analysis took the subscales of the Brief Cope and loaded them into problem or emotion-focused coping. I then used repeated measures ANOVAS to look at variance in stress, personality, and coping over time. First off in this graph, we have mean stress scores for relationship and task-oriented students across all 4 time points. The highest stress scores for both personality types can be seen at time 1, which is when GSE begins. Next, we have mean stress scores for emotion and problem-focused copers over all of the time points. Again, higher stress for both types can be seen in the earlier stages of GSE. With my first repeated measures ANOVA, there is no significance at all for relationship-oriented students. For task-oriented students, there was no overall significance. However, slight significance was found in the pairwise comparisons between time 1 and time 3. The high variability across all of the time points may have diffused this significance. A similar situation was noted in both of my coping ANOVAs. For problem-focused copers, there was no within-subject significance, but as can be seen from pairwise comparisons, there is significance in mean stress of problem-focused copers between time 1 and time 2. The same scenario is present in this final ANOVA, which looks at mean stress scores of emotion-focused copers over time. There is no within-subject significance, but the pairwise significance here is between time points 2 and 3. So looking back at the stress means graphs, I've circled the significance that was found between time points 1 and 3 for task-oriented students. We went from a mean stress score of 2.756 to 2.25. And looking back at stress means for coping, in the black circles, we can see the change from time 1 to time 2 with problem-focused copers, showing a drop from 2.81 to 2.54. And in the red circles, there is a drop from 2.91 to 1.64, and this is for emotion-focused copers. For both relationship and task-oriented students, as well as problem-focused copers, stress decreased between time 1 and time 2, which could be due to acclimation to the summer program environment. Emotion-focused copers had a rise in stress at this time point, which could be an indicator of an inability to properly adapt. Next, looking at stress between time points 2 and 3, we have the condition of the students returning home for a week. Changes in stress levels could have many possible causes here. For instance, is it comforting for students to return home to familiarity? Or is it more stressful to leave GSE, where they feel that they belong and have formed new relationships and learned exciting things? As far as personality, relationship-oriented students faced an increase in stress during this time, which suggests complications between relationships at home versus governor's school. Task-oriented students had a slight decrease in stress, and it's hypothesized that this is because of their ability to maintain focused and goal-oriented. Moving on to coping, problem-focused copers' stress means stayed constant, and this is where we saw the large drop in stress of emotion-focused copers. It would take further research to determine if the emotion-focused coping strategies, like denial, behavioral disengagement, or humor, decrease the stress of the situation. There could also be other variables that cause this sharp decline. A commonality found in all of the ANOVAs were that there was high variance in stress across time points. So overall, it didn't look like much was going on. But if we look individually from time point to time point and take into consideration the personality type or coping style or other circumstance, such as when the students go home, it makes sense to result in smaller significances for certain groups. My hypothesis that students with task-oriented personality would have lower stress scores at each of the time points was supported. However, my hypothesis that problem-focused copers would have lower stress was not supported. It turned out that emotion-focused copers had lower stress levels at 3 out of the 4 time points. This does not support past literature like Roxas and Glenwick, who we mentioned earlier. They found that active coping leads to better adjustment, but in the present study, we see that emotion-focused copers had lower stress scores. This study had many limitations, which should be considered when discussing results. First, the governor's school program spans many disciplines, and my sample only came from the social science sector. Also, 48 participants is a relatively small sample for drawing conclusions about personality and coping styles, which should be studied over a longer period of time to establish consistency. I did not have a baseline stress level for my participants, and also venting, one of the subscales on the brief cope, was discounted because it did not load strongly with either problem or emotion coping. More needs to be done with this scale to confirm how coping styles are to be loaded and grouped. Looking into the future with these data, I would like to re-examine this sample and see if task-oriented students are more likely to be problem-focused copers, because both of these traits do have commonalities. In relation to the future of GSE, teachers and teacher assistants should be in tune with the stress levels of their students in order to help them take full advantage of the GSE experience. Other future implications involve helping rising high school seniors cope with the beginning stages of a large life transition to college and making sure they're properly prepared. Different types of students may cope in different ways, and understanding this can make the transition easier. With the expansion of sample size and diversity, these variables could be used to create some kind of model for how to best counsel students during transitions based on their personality, the way they cope, and their strengths. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I would like to extend thanks to my advisor, Dr. Cynthia Edwards, the lab manager, Ali Kwasnica, and the entire Meredith Emerging Adulthood Longitudinal Studies Lab for their support. If you have any questions about my research, please feel free to reach out to me at my email. Thanks again.